A little girl whispers, "There's a camera in your office." Millionaire exposes spy fiancé. Before we dive in, hit the like button if you believe kindness can change the world. Enjoy the story. 8-year-old Isla Monroe had learned to watch before she spoke. In the 3 foster homes before this one, watching had kept her safe. Watching had taught her which adults meant what they said, and which ones smiled while their eyes stayed cold. Now standing in the doorway of Eli's home office, she watched again. Her adoptive father sat rigid at his mahogany desk, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his computer screen. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the room filled with technology that hummed and blinked, like a digital heartbeat. Eli Monroe, 30 years old and already worth millions from his cybersecurity empire, barely glanced up when Isla appeared. His fingers danced across the keyboard as he spoke into his headset about encryption algorithms and security protocols. To most people, he was a genius. To Isla, he was still a stranger who decided to do something good by adopting her. She'd been living in his sprawling suburban home for 6 months and still felt like a visitor who might be asked to leave at any moment. Eli provided everything she needed: a beautiful room, the best schools, more toys than she'd ever imagined. But he provided them the same way he managed his business accounts. Efficiently, distantly, with good intentions but little warmth. Isla's small fingers traced the doorframe as she summoned her courage. There were things she needed to tell him, things she'd seen that made her stomach twist with worry. But every time she tried to speak to Eli about anything important, he seemed to look right through her, as if she were just another problem to be solved with money and good planning. The Zoom call droned on. Eli discussed firewalls and data protection with faceless executives, while Isla shifted her weight from foot to foot. She'd been standing there for 10 minutes, waiting for him to notice her, when something made her step forward. Later, she wouldn't be able to explain what gave her the courage. Maybe it was the way the light caught something small and black tucked behind the gilt-framed painting Sabrina had given Eli last month. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's voice, telling her that truth was more important than politeness. Or maybe it was simply that 8-year-old hearts know things that 30-year-old minds have forgotten. Isla walked to Eli's chair and gently tugged on his sleeve. He held up one finger without looking at her, the universal adult signal for wait. But Isla had waited long enough. She tugged again, more insistently. "Just a second, sweetie," Eli murmured, still focused on his screen. This time, Isla didn't wait. She leaned close to his ear and whispered the words that would change everything. "There's a camera in your office, but it's not yours." The effect was immediate and electric. Eli's fingers froze above the keyboard. His entire body went rigid, as if he'd been struck by lightning. The executive on the Zoom call continued talking about quarterly projections, but Eli heard nothing except the echo of those 8 words from the small girl beside him. "Gentlemen, I need to call you back," he said abruptly, ending the meeting, without explanation. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of electronics and the thundering of Eli's heartbeat. He turned to look at Eli, really look at her, perhaps for the first time since she'd arrived. Her brown eyes, usually so quiet and watchful, now blazed with urgency. "What did you say?" he asked, though he'd heard her perfectly. "There's a camera in your office," Isla repeated, pointing toward the painting above his bookshelf. "Behind the gold frame. I've been watching it blink at night when you're not here." Eli followed her gaze to the expensive oil painting Sabrina had insisted on buying for him last month, a romantic landscape of rolling hills and wildflowers. "To brighten up your workspace," she'd said with her devastating smile. "Every successful man needs beauty in his environment." His mouth went dry as puzzle pieces began clicking into place with mechanical precision. Sabrina's sudden interest in his work schedule, her habit of tidying his office while he was on calls, the way she always seemed to know exactly when he'd be working late, arriving with coffee and kisses at precisely the right moments. "How long? Have you been watching it?" he asked Isla, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since she hung it up," Isla said simply. "I use my tablet to scan for signals when I can't sleep. There are lots of them in the house now. But that one's different. It's not connected to our network. Eli stared at this small girl who just turned his world upside down with a single sentence. In 6 months of living together, they'd barely had a real conversation. He'd hired the best nannies, enrolled her in the most prestigious schools, bought her everything a child could want. But he'd never really listened to her. He'd never imagined that behind those quiet, watchful eyes was a mind sharp enough to detect surveillance equipment that he, a cybersecurity expert, had missed entirely. The weight of what she was telling him began to settle like ice in his chest. If there was a camera, if someone was watching, if Sabrina was involved, the prototype security algorithm he'd been developing, worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, sat on the very computer he used every day in this room. Isla, he said, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as a responsibility or a good deed, but as a person, as someone who might just have saved him from a catastrophe he never saw coming. We need to talk. Isla's revelation hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had just begun to burn. Eli pushed back from his desk, his mind racing through implications and possibilities, while the 8-year-old girl who'd just potentially saved his empire waited patiently for him to process what she'd told him. "Show me," he said finally. "Show me everything you've seen." For the first time since she'd arrived at his house, Isla smiled. Not the polite, careful smile she wore around adults, but a real one. Someone was finally listening. She retrieved her tablet from where she'd left it on the hallway table, her small fingers moving with surprising confidence across the screen. Eli watched, fascinated despite his growing anxiety, as she navigated through apps he didn't recognize. "I learned this from watching you," she explained, pulling up a signal detection program. "When you were working on the router configuration last month, I downloaded it to see what was making my room feel buzzy at night." The tablet screen filled with a network map of their house. Eli recognized his own devices, computers, phones, smart home systems, security cameras. But there were others, unfamiliar signals that made his blood run cold. "There," Isla pointed to a cluster of red dots. "These appeared after Sabrina started visiting more often. This big one is behind your painting. This smaller one is in the living room, inside that crystal vase she brought you. And this one," she scrolled to show the master bedroom, "is in your nightstand." Eli's world tilted. The woman he'd been falling in love with, the woman he'd been considering proposing to, had been systematically bugging his home. Every private conversation, every business call, every intimate moment, all of it recorded and transmitted to unknown receivers. "How long have you known?" he asked, surprised by how steady his voice remained. 3 weeks, Isla said quietly. "I kept trying to tell you, but..." She trailed off, but they both knew why she'd hesitated. He'd been too busy, too distracted by work and by Sabrina's intoxicating presence to pay attention to anything an 8-year-old might have to say. "Tell me about Sabrina," he said. "What have you seen her do?" Isla's expression grew serious, taking on that watchful quality he now realized meant she was remembering everything with perfect clarity. Children who'd been through the foster system learned to pay attention to details adults missed. Their survival had once depended on reading the signs correctly. "She comes here when you're not home sometimes," Isla began. "She has a key, but she always acts surprised when I see her, like she forgot I'd be here. She says she's cleaning or organizing, but she never actually cleans anything." Eli's hands clenched into fists. He'd given Sabrina a key 3 months ago, a gesture that had felt romantic and significant at the time. She'd cried when he'd presented it to her, saying no one had ever trusted her like that before. "She goes through your office," Isla continued, "not just looking around but photographing things. She has this tiny camera smaller than a phone. I saw her take pictures of papers on your desk, and she always puts them back exactly where they were." "What else?" "She asks me questions." Isla's voice grew even quieter. "About your schedule, about when you work late, about your friends. She makes it seem like she's just being nice, trying to get to know me better. But foster kids learn to recognize When adults are fishing for information, the words hit Eli like physical blows. Every casual conversation, every seemingly innocent question Sabrina had asked about his work, his business relationships, his daily routines, it had all been intelligence gathering. And she'd been using Isla, an 8-year-old child who'd already been abandoned and betrayed by the adults meant to protect her, as an unwitting source. "There's something else," Isla said, her brown eyes meeting his directly. "I think someone else is helping her." "What do you mean?" "Miles comes by sometimes when you're traveling. He and Sabrina meet in your office. They whisper a lot and look at papers together. Last week I heard him say something about making sure the timeline matches the product launch." Miles Wren, Eli's CFO and one of his oldest friends. They'd built the company together from nothing, shared dreams and struggles and victories. If Miles was involved, Eli's rational mind tried to reject what Isla was telling him. These were extraordinary accusations against people he trusted, people he loved. But the evidence was mounting and he couldn't ignore the sophisticated surveillance equipment she'd detected throughout his home. "Isla," he said carefully, "why didn't you just ask me about the devices? Why did you investigate? On your own?" She looked down at her tablet, suddenly seeming very young. "Because adults don't usually believe kids, especially kids like me, and because—" She paused, struggling with something. "Because I thought maybe you already knew. Maybe it was part of your security system, and I was being paranoid." The admission broke something inside Eli's chest. This brilliant, observant child had been carrying the weight of this discovery alone for weeks, uncertain whether to trust her own perceptions or the adults around her. She'd been protecting him while simultaneously protecting herself from the disappointment of not being believed. "I believe you," he said firmly, "and I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner." Isla's smile this time was radiant. "So what do we do now?" For the first time in their 6 months together, Eli looked at Isla as a partner rather than a responsibility. Her insights had already proven more valuable than those of his entire security team. Her careful observation and technological aptitude had uncovered a sophisticated espionage operation that could have destroyed everything he'd built. "Now," he said, "we figure out exactly what they're after, and we stop them. Trust is earned in moments like these. Think about a time when someone surprised you with their wisdom or strength." The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching the weight of secrets that now filled Eli's house. He'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through implications and possibilities, while Sabrina slept peacefully beside him. Every breath she took felt like a lie, every unconscious touch like a betrayal. Isla found him in the kitchen at dawn, dark circles under his eyes as he mechanically stirred coffee he wouldn't drink. She was already dressed for school, her small backpack slung over her shoulder. But her expression suggested she hadn't slept any better than he had. "We need help," she said without preamble, settling onto the bar stool across from him. "I've been thinking about it all night. If Miles is involved, we can't trust anyone from your company. And if Sabrina suspects we know, she might destroy evidence or disappear." Eli marveled again at this child's clarity of thought. At 30, he'd built a multi-million-dollar empire through strategic thinking and calculated risks. But Isla, at 8 years old and with no formal training in business or espionage, had immediately grasped the essential problem they faced. "Who do you suggest?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Josephine," Isla said without hesitation. "She's been with your family since before you started the company. She sees everything that happens in this house, but people treat her like she's invisible. And—" Isla paused, suddenly looking uncertain. "She's the only adult who's ever really listened to me here?" Josephine Chen had been the Monroe family's property manager for 15 years, ever since Eli's parents had first hired her to maintain their estate. When they died in a car accident 5 years ago, Eli had kept her on, partly out of loyalty, and partly because she ran his household with quiet efficiency that freed him to focus on his business. At 69, Josephine had seen 3 generations of Monroes through their triumphs and disasters. More importantly, as Isla had noted, She was one of the few people who treated the 8-year-old like a person rather than a project. Josephine, it is, Eli decided. Can you ask her to meet us in the library after school? Tell her it's important, but don't say why over the phone. Isla nodded solemnly, understanding the implications of operational security better than most adults. She slipped off the bar stool and headed toward the door, then turned back. Eli? Her voice was smaller now, vulnerable in a way that reminded him she was still just a child carrying an enormous burden. What if we're wrong? What if Sabrina really loves you, and there's some other explanation? The question revealed both her intelligence and her heart. Even after everything she'd observed, even with the evidence she'd gathered, Isla was still hoping she might be mistaken. She wanted the adults in her life to be trustworthy, wanted the family she'd found to be real and safe. Then we'll figure that out too, Eli said gently. But Isla, your instincts have been right about everything so far. Don't doubt yourself now. That afternoon, the three of them gathered in Eli's home library, surrounded by shelves of books that represented decades of accumulated knowledge and wisdom. Josephine listened without interruption as Isla and Eli laid out their discoveries, her weathered hands folded calmly in her lap, her dark eyes sharp and alert behind wire-rimmed glasses. When they finished, she sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything they'd told her. I've been wondering about Miss Sabrina for weeks, she said finally, her accented English precise as always. Little things that didn't quite add up. She knew too much about your business schedules, seemed too interested in details about your friends and associates, and she has a way of watching people when she thinks they're not looking. What kind of watching? Eli asked. The kind that measures and calculates, Josephine replied. I've seen it before in people who aren't what they pretend to be. She studies you, Mr. Eli, studies this house, studies your routines. It's not the way someone in love observes their partner. It's the way someone gathers intelligence. Isla leaned forward eagerly. You've noticed other things too, haven't you? Josephine smiled at the girl with genuine affection. You see everything, don't you, little one? Yes, I've noticed other things. Phone calls she takes in her car after visiting. The way she's always here during important business calls even when she claims to be busy elsewhere. And yesterday, I found her in your father's office at 6 in the morning, supposedly looking for a book. At 6 a.m.? Eli's voice sharpened. She said she couldn't sleep and wanted to borrow something to read, but she was standing by your computer, not near the bookshelves, and she looked startled when I appeared. Guilty. The three of them sat in heavy silence as the weight of accumulated evidence settled around them. Separately, each observation might have been explained away. Together, they painted a picture of systematic deception and surveillance. So what's our next move? Josephine asked. And Eli realized she'd automatically positioned herself as part of their team. This elegant, dignified woman who'd spent decades managing households and keeping family secrets was ready to help them expose a conspiracy that threatened everything they held dear. We need proof, Eli said. Real evidence that will hold up, if this goes to court or gets reported to the authorities. And we need to find out who she's working for and what they're really after. I can help with that, Isla said quietly. The surveillance devices she planted, they work both ways. If I can access their signals, I might be able to trace where they're transmitting to, maybe even intercept what they're sending. Both adults stared at her in amazement. This 8-year-old girl was proposing to conduct counter-surveillance operations that would challenge experienced intelligence professionals. Where did you learn to do that? Josephine asked gently. Isla shrugged, suddenly looking embarrassed. I read a lot. And I watch you work, she said to Eli. Your cybersecurity programs aren't that different from the apps kids use to monitor network traffic for gaming. I just adapted them. Eli felt a surge of something that might have been pride, followed immediately by protective worry. Isla's capabilities were remarkable, but she was still a child who'd already been through too much. The last thing he wanted was to put her in danger. Absolutely not, he said firmly. This is getting too dangerous for you to be involved. Isla's expression shifted, her eyes flashing with the stubborn determination he was beginning to recognize as purely her own. "I'm already involved. I'm the one who discovered this. And I'm the only one who's been successfully watching them without being detected." "She's right," Josephine said quietly. "And more than that, she's been keeping herself safe in this house for months while observing things the rest of us missed. Isla isn't just smart, Mr. Eli. She's careful. She's survived situations that would break most adults." Eli looked between these two females who'd somehow become his most trusted allies in the space of 24 hours. An 8-year-old girl with the observational skills of a trained spy and the moral clarity of someone who'd learned to distinguish truth from deception through necessity. And a 69-year-old woman who'd spent decades watching and protecting, who understood loyalty and recognized threats with the wisdom of experience. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this together. No one takes risks alone. We watch out for each other." Isla's smile lit up the room. "So we're like a real family now?" The question caught Eli off guard with its simple directness. Family. Not the arrangement of convenience and obligation he'd thought he was providing, but something real and chosen and mutual. "Yes," he said, and meant it completely. "We're like a real family now. Sometimes the most unlikely allies become the strongest. Teams. Who has stood beside you when it really mattered?" 3 days later, their carefully laid plans collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Eli stood in his office, holding the tiny surveillance device Josephine had carefully extracted from behind Sabrina's painting, while his world tilted on its axis. The evidence was undeniable now. A sophisticated piece of equipment worth thousands of dollars, broadcasting on encrypted frequencies to receivers they'd traced to a location downtown. But when he'd confronted Sabrina with it an hour ago, expecting guilt or confession or at least surprise, she'd looked at him with such genuine confusion and hurt that he'd begun to doubt everything. "You think I'm spying on you?" she'd whispered, tears gathering in her green eyes. "Eli, how could you even imagine I'd do something like that?" Her reaction had been so perfect, so utterly believable that for a moment he'd wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. Sabrina was an actress by training, he reminded himself, a media expert who understood exactly how to manipulate emotions and perceptions. But the pain in her eyes had seemed so real. "Maybe there's another explanation," he'd found himself saying, hating the uncertainty in his own voice. "Maybe someone else planted these devices, someone trying to frame you or destroy our relationship." Sabrina had thrown herself into his arms then, sobbing against his chest, whispering about how scared she was that someone was targeting them, how grateful she was that he was willing to consider her innocence. And that's when Isla had walked into the room. The 8-year-old had taken one look at the scene, Sabrina crying in Eli's arms, the surveillance device abandoned on his desk, and her face had gone completely blank. Not hurt or disappointed, but empty. Shut down. It was an expression Eli recognized from their first few weeks together, when she'd still been braced for rejection and abandonment. "Isla, sweetheart," he'd started, but she'd turned and walked away without a word. Now, an hour later, he couldn't find her anywhere in the house. Josephine was searching the grounds while he combed through every room, calling her name, growing more frantic with each empty space. He found her finally in the last place he thought to look, the small storage room behind the garage where they kept holiday decorations and forgotten furniture. She was curled up behind a stack of boxes, her tablet clutched against her chest, her face streaked with tears she'd tried to wipe away. "Isla." He sank down beside her, his heart breaking, at the defeat in her small frame. "Talk to me, sweetheart." "You don't believe me," she said quietly, not looking at him. "I showed you everything, I explained everything, but you still choose her." "That's not true. I do believe you. The evidence is overwhelming." "Then why is she still here?" Isla's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through him like a blade. "Why are you letting her cry on you and tell you she's innocent when we both know she's lying?" Eli had no answer for that. Or rather, he had an answer he didn't want to admit. Despite everything they'd discovered, despite the surveillance equipment, And the documented deception? Part of him still wanted to believe Sabrina was innocent. Part of him was still susceptible to her tears and her explanations and the intoxicating possibility that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. "Adults are complicated," he said lamely. "Sometimes we want things to be true even when we know they're not." Isla finally looked at him, and the disappointment in her brown eyes was devastating. "I thought you were different. I thought you actually listened." "I am listening. I did listen." "No," she said with the terrible clarity of a child who'd been let down too many times. "You listened to what I said, but you didn't believe it was more important than what you wanted, just like all the other adults." She was right, and they both knew it. Eli had spent his entire adult life making hard decisions based on evidence and logic, cutting ties with people who threatened his business or betrayed his trust. But when it came to Sabrina, when it came to his own emotional needs and desires, he'd wavered. He'd allowed doubt to creep in, not because the evidence was weak, but because accepting it would mean losing something he desperately wanted to keep. "You're right," he said quietly. "You're absolutely right, and I'm sorry." Isla studied his face with those two wise eyes. "Are you sorry enough to do something about it?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, Sabrina is still in our house right now, probably, planting more devices or stealing more information while we're out here talking. I mean, Miles is probably getting a report from her tonight about how successfully she handled your suspicions. I mean, they're going to keep doing this until they get whatever they came for, and then they'll disappear and leave us with nothing." Eli felt something shift inside his chest, a hardening of resolve that reminded him why he'd been successful in business for so long. Isla was right. While he'd been wrestling with his emotions and hoping for impossible explanations, the people who'd betrayed them were probably making their final moves. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "I need you to trust me," Isla said simply. "Not just believe me, but actually trust me enough to let me help catch them. I've been working on something while you were figuring things out." She opened her tablet and showed him a screen full of data streams and network traffic that looked like something from his own cybersecurity programs. "I've been monitoring their communications for the past 3 days. They're planning something big for tomorrow night, something called final extraction that involves your prototype algorithm." "How do you know all this?" "Because I hacked their surveillance system," Isla said matter-of-factly. "The same way they've been watching us, I've been watching them." "And Eli?" Her voice grew harder, more determined than any 8-year-olds should ever need to be. "They're not just stealing your algorithm. They're planning to destroy your reputation by making it look like you sold it voluntarily. Miles has been preparing documents that make you look like a willing collaborator." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with crystalline clarity. This wasn't just industrial espionage. It was character assassination designed to destroy him completely while enriching his enemies. And he'd almost let it happen because he'd been too emotionally compromised to trust the one person who'd been trying to save him. Eli looked at this remarkable child who'd been abandoned by multiple families, who'd learned to read deception and betrayal in adults' faces as a survival skill, who'd used her pain and experience to develop instincts that had already saved him once. "I trust you," he said, and this time he meant it completely. "What's the plan?" Isla's smile was fierce and determined. "We're going to give them exactly what they want, and when they take it, we're going to be ready. The hardest lessons come when we realize our hearts and our minds are telling us different things. Have you ever had to choose between what you wanted to believe and what you knew was true?" The truth came in fragments over the next 18 hours, each piece more damning than the last. Josephine found the first breakthrough while sorting through financial records she'd quietly been investigating. Miles Wren, Eli's trusted CFO and supposed best friend, had received 3 separate wire transfers totaling $200,000 over the past 6 months. The money had come from shell companies ultimately traced to Apex Industries, Eli's biggest competitor in the cybersecurity market. "He's been selling you out from the beginning," Josephine told Eli grimly as they huddled around her laptop in the library. "Every business strategy, every client meeting, every product development timeline, he's had access to all of it, but It was Isla who uncovered the scope of their betrayal. Using techniques that impressed even Eli's professional paranoia, she'd managed to decrypt portions of the communications between Sabrina and her handlers. What they revealed was a conspiracy more sophisticated and cold-blooded than any of them had imagined. "Look at this," Isla said, pulling up intercepted text messages on her tablet. "Sabrina isn't just some corporate spy they hired. She's been working for Apex for 3 years, specializing in what they call intimate infiltration of target executives." Eli's blood turned to ice as he read over her shoulder. The messages discussed Sabrina's previous assignments: a defense contractor in D.C., a pharmaceutical executive in Boston, a tech startup founder in Seattle. All men, all successful, all subsequently destroyed when their trade secrets were stolen and their companies collapsed under mysterious scandals. "She's done this before," he said numbly, "multiple times." "It gets worse," Isla continued, scrolling through more intercepted data. "They've been planning your destruction for almost a year. Miles gave them your psychological profile, your relationship history, even details about your parents' death. They designed Sabrina's entire persona specifically to appeal to you." The casual cruelty of it stole Eli's breath. Every moment of their relationship had been calculated. Her interest in technology, her admiration for his work, her tears when he'd given her the house key, all of it scripted and performed by a woman who saw him as nothing more than a target to be exploited. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. "Tomorrow night's extraction isn't just about stealing your prototype," Isla said, her young voice heavy with understanding far beyond her years. "They're going to frame you for corporate espionage. Miles has been creating a paper trail that makes it look like you've been selling secrets to foreign competitors for months. When the FBI raids your office tomorrow, they'll find evidence that you're a traitor to your own country." "What evidence?" Eli asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Forged documents in your handwriting. Bank accounts opened in your name with suspicious deposits. Communications with overseas buyers that look real enough to fool investigators." Isla's eyes met his directly. "They're not just stealing from you, Eli. They're going to destroy your life so completely that even if you prove your innocence, eventually no one will ever trust you again." Eli sat in stunned silence as the full magnitude of the trap became clear. His business would be ruined. His reputation would be destroyed. He'd likely face federal charges that could put him in prison for decades. And worst of all, Isla would be left alone again. Returned to the foster system because her adoptive father was a convicted criminal. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why go to such extremes? The algorithm is valuable, but not worth this level of risk and complexity." "Because it's not just about the algorithm," Josephine said quietly. She'd been reading through more of the intercepted communications, her face grave. "Apex Industries is planning a hostile takeover of your entire company. With you disgraced and facing criminal charges, your stock price will collapse. They'll be able to buy controlling interest for pennies on the dollar. It's brilliant in a horrible way," Isla added with the analytical clarity that never failed to amaze him. "They get your technology, your company, your market share, and your client base, all for the cost of bribing one employee and hiring one very skilled actress." Eli looked around the library at these two extraordinary people who'd become his family, in the most unlikely way possible. Josephine, whose loyalty and wisdom had sustained him through tragedy and triumph. Isla, whose courage and insight had saved him from destruction he'd never seen coming. They were depending on him to protect them, and he'd almost failed them completely. "Not if we stop them first," he said, his voice carrying the hard edge of determination that had built his empire from nothing. "Josephine, can you get us copies of everything Miles has been falsifying? I want to know exactly what evidence they're planning to plant." "Already working on it," she replied with a smile that was pure steel. "I've been his assistant for 5 years. I know where he keeps everything." "And Isla?" Eli turned to the 8-year-old, who'd somehow become his most valuable ally. "How much can you intercept of their communications without them detecting you?" "All of it," she said confidently. "They're using encrypted channels, but they're not expecting to be monitored by their own surveillance equipment. I can see every message, every plan, every backup strategy they've prepared. Then here's what we're going to do, Eli said, feeling the familiar thrill of a chess game where he finally understood his opponent's strategy. We're going to let them execute their plan exactly as they've designed it. But when they reach for the prize, they're going to find we've set a trap of our own. What kind of trap? Isla asked, her eyes bright with anticipation. Eli's smile was sharp as a blade, the kind that turns predators into prey. Tomorrow night, when they think they're destroying me, we're going to destroy them instead. And we're going to make sure the whole world knows exactly what they tried to do. For the first time since this nightmare began, Eli felt like himself again. Not the love-struck fool who'd been manipulated by a beautiful woman, not the betrayed friend who'd been sold out by his business partner, but the strategic thinker who'd built something from nothing and wasn't about to let anyone take it away. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Justice rarely comes easy, but it's always worth fighting for. When have you had to stand up against people who underestimated your strength? The next evening arrived with the weight of destiny hanging in the air like storm clouds before lightning strikes. Eli's house, which had been a home filled with warmth and growing trust just days ago, now felt like a stage set for the final act of an elaborate drama where everything, his future, his freedom, his family, hung in the balance. Sabrina moved through the house with her usual grace, preparing for what she believed would be her final performance. She'd spent the day playing the concerned girlfriend perfectly, asking worried questions about his stress levels, suggesting they have a quiet dinner at home to help him relax before his big product launch tomorrow. She had no idea that every word she spoke was being recorded, every move she made was being monitored, and every electronic signal from her hidden communication devices was being intercepted and decoded by an 8-year-old girl who'd learned espionage out of necessity and refined it through pure determination. The extraction begins at 11 p.m., Isla whispered to Eli as they passed in the hallway. Miles will create a distraction by triggering the fire alarm at your office building. While security is focused on that, Sabrina will download the final algorithm files and transmit them to the overseas buyers. And the frame job? Already in motion. The FBI has received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity in your accounts. They're planning to raid your office at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, just after the technology transfer is complete. Eli marveled, again at the sophistication of their enemies' planning. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated to ensure maximum damage with minimal risk to themselves. If Isla hadn't detected their surveillance, if she hadn't trusted her instincts and kept investigating despite being dismissed by adults, the trap would have been perfect. But they had detected it. And now the hunters were about to discover they'd been hunting something far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. At 10:30 p.m., Eli made his move. I'm going to check on some files at the office, he announced to Sabrina, who was curled up on the couch with a book, the picture of domestic contentment. I know it's late, but I want to review everything one more time before tomorrow's presentation. Sabrina's eyes flickered, just for an instant, with something that might have been excitement. Of course, darling. You know how important this is. I'll just stay here and finish my book. Actually, Eli said, as if the thought had just occurred to him, why don't you come with me? I could use the company and you always make me feel more confident. For a split second, Sabrina's mask slipped. Eli caught a glimpse of calculation behind her loving smile, the rapid mental adjustment as she weighed the implications of this unexpected invitation. I'd love to, she said finally, but I'm feeling a bit tired. Besides, you work better when you're not distracted by me. She accompanied this with the sultry smile that had captivated him for months. You're probably right, Eli agreed, leaning down to kiss her forehead. I'll be back in a few hours. He left through the front door, making sure she heard his car start and drive away. But instead of going to his office, he circled back through the woods behind his property and slipped into the house, through the basement entrance Josephine had left unlocked for him. From the hidden observation post they'd set up in the unused maids' quarters, Eli, Isla, and Josephine watched Sabrina spring into action with the efficiency of a trained operative. The moment she was certain Eli was gone, her entire demeanor changed. The soft, loving girlfriend disappeared, replaced by a focused professional who moved with predatory purpose. She retrieved a sophisticated laptop from the hiding place she'd created in the guest bathroom, connected it to Eli's home network, and began what was clearly a well-rehearsed process of data infiltration. "She's good," Isla whispered admiringly. "Watch how she's bypassing the security protocols. She must have been studying your system for months." "Not good enough," Eli replied grimly. "She's downloading from the decoy server we set up this afternoon. Every file she's stealing is either worthless or contains tracking malware that will lead us straight to her buyers." Meanwhile, Josephine monitored communications from Miles, who was indeed at Eli's office building, preparing to trigger the fire alarm that would provide cover for Sabrina's activities. His text messages to his Apex handlers revealed a man convinced he was about to become wealthy beyond his dreams. At 11:15 p.m., everything went according to the conspirators' plan. The fire alarm at Eli's office building created chaos, as security teams responded to what appeared to be a genuine emergency. Sabrina completed her download and began transmitting the stolen files to encrypted servers overseas. Miles prepared to plant the forged evidence that would frame Eli for treason. What they didn't know was that every step of their operation was being broadcast live to a secure government server, where federal agents were recording everything for what would become the most comprehensive case of corporate espionage in recent history. At 11:45 p.m., Sabrina received the text message she'd been waiting for. Package delivered. Initiate Phase 2. Phase 2 was the destruction of evidence and her own disappearance. Within minutes, she would delete all traces of her activities, plant the final pieces of incriminating evidence against Eli, and vanish forever. By tomorrow morning, she'd be on a plane to a non-extradition country with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Instead, she found herself looking into the faces of Eli, Isla, and Josephine as they emerged from their hiding place. "Hello, Sabrina," Eli said calmly. "Or should I call you by your real name? Rebecca Santos, age 31, wanted by the FBI for industrial espionage in 4 states. The transformation was instantaneous and chilling. The woman who'd spent months convincing him she loved him disappeared completely, replaced by someone whose eyes held nothing but cold calculation and barely contained rage. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," she said, her voice carrying an entirely different accent now. "This is bigger than your little company, bigger than your naive understanding of how the world really works." "You're right," Eli agreed. "It is bigger than I understood. That's why the FBI has been recording everything for the past 6 hours. That's why your buyers overseas are actually federal agents conducting a sting operation. And that's why Miles is currently being arrested." At my office building, Sabrina's face went white as the full scope of their counter-operation became clear. "Impossible. We monitored everything. We controlled every variable." "You controlled every variable except one," Isla said, stepping forward with the quiet confidence of someone who'd outmaneuvered adults far more experienced than herself. "You never considered that an 8-year-old foster kid might be smarter than your entire operation." The look Sabrina turned on Isla was pure venom. "You little—" "I wouldn't finish that sentence," Eli interrupted, his voice carrying a warning that made Sabrina take an involuntary step backward. "You're talking to the person who saved my life and exposed your entire criminal network. Show some respect." Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder as federal agents surrounded the house. The trap that had taken months to set was finally springing shut, not on Eli, but on the people who'd tried to destroy him. Justice, Eli reflected, sometimes came in the most unexpected packages. The most satisfying victories are the ones where the underestimated rise up to protect what matters most. 6 weeks later, Eli stood in the courthouse lobby watching Miles Wren being led away in handcuffs, his former CFO and supposed best friend now facing federal charges that would likely keep him imprisoned for the next 20 years. The man who'd helped him build his company from nothing, who'd shared dreams and struggles and what Eli had believed was genuine friendship, had looked right through him as if he were a stranger. Betrayal, Eli had learned, left scars that went deeper than any physical wound. But healing, he was discovering, could come from the most unexpected sources. He looked smaller than I remembered, Isla observed quietly from beside him. At 8 years old, she'd become the star witness in a federal investigation that had unraveled a corporate espionage network spanning multiple industries and several countries. Her testimony had been so clear, so detailed, and so technologically sophisticated that prosecutors were calling it the most compelling evidence they'd ever presented. "People usually do when you see them clearly," Josephine replied, adjusting Isla's new dress. The formal adoption proceedings had concluded an hour ago, and Isla Monroe was now officially, legally, and permanently part of their family. Eli looked down at the adoption certificate in his hands, the legal document that meant far less than the emotional truth they'd all discovered over the past 2 months. Family wasn't about paperwork or blood relations or good intentions. It was about choosing to stand together when the world tried to tear you apart. It was about trust earned through crisis and love proven through action. "So what happens now?" Isla asked, slipping her small hand into his. The gesture was natural now, comfortable in a way that spoke of security and belonging rather than politeness or duty. "Now we go home," Eli said simply. "To our home." The house felt different when they walked through the front door that evening. The surveillance equipment had been removed. The hidden cameras and listening devices that had turned their sanctuary into a stage for deception were gone. But more than that, the very air felt cleaner, honest in a way it hadn't been since Sabrina had first crossed the threshold with her calculated smiles and scripted affection. They'd redecorated together over the past few weeks, the three of them, choosing new furniture and colors and artwork that reflected who they actually were rather than who they thought they should be. Isla's drawings now hung in frames alongside expensive paintings. Josephine's family photos had places of honor on the mantelpiece. The house had become a home in every sense that mattered. "I have something for you," Eli told Isla as they settled. In the living room with hot chocolate and the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to perform for each other, he handed her a small wrapped box, watching as her eyes widened with the delight of a child who was still learning that good surprises were possible in her life. Inside was a device that looked like a sophisticated smartphone, but was actually something far more special. A prototype, security scanner Eli had been developing specifically for her, incorporating all the techniques she'd used to detect the surveillance equipment that had saved them both. "It's yours," he said. "Your own invention, based on your innovations. I filed the patents in your name." Isla stared at the device, then at him, her brown eyes filling with tears. "Mine? Really mine? Really yours? You're the youngest patent holder in the history of cybersecurity technology. And when you turn 18, the licensing fees will have generated enough money to pay for any college you want to attend." But it wasn't the financial implications that made Isla cry. It was the recognition, the acknowledgement, that her contributions had been real and valuable and worthy of protection for a child who'd spent years being dismissed and overlooked. Having her innovations legally recognized and protected was validation of the deepest kind. "There's something else," Josephine said gently, producing an envelope from her purse. "This came today." Inside was a letter from the FBI's Cybercrimes Division, formally thanking Isla for her assistance in breaking up what they were calling one of the most sophisticated industrial espionage rings in American history. They were recommending her for a civilian commendation, an honor that would become part of her permanent record and a testament to her courage and capability. "They want to know if you'd be interested in consulting work when you're older," Eli explained. "Apparently your methods impressed some very important people in Washington." Isla looked at the letter, then at the two adults who'd become her chosen family, and smiled with pure happiness. "Will you help me write back to them?" "Of course," Eli said. "We'll do it together. Everything together from now on." As evening settled around them, they talked about practical things. School schedules and vacation plans and the security upgrades they wanted to install now that they understood how vulnerable their previous systems had been. But underneath the ordinary domestic conversations ran a deeper current of connection and commitment. They'd been tested by betrayal and conspiracy, by people who'd tried to use their trust against them, and their love as a weapon for destruction. They'd survived not just intact, but stronger, bound together by crisis in ways that good times alone could never have achieved. "I love you both," Isla said, as Josephine tucked her into bed that night, the words spoken with the simple directness of someone who no longer feared that love was temporary or conditional. "We love you too, darling," Josephine replied, kissing her forehead. "Forever and always." Eli stood in the doorway watching this bedtime ritual that had become precious to him, thinking about how completely his life had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful but lonely man who'd adopted a child out of a sense of obligation and social responsibility. Tonight, he was part of a family that had chosen each other through trial by fire and emerged stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. Love, he'd learned, wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you did every day, through the small acts of attention and care that said, "You're important to me, you matter, your voice is heard," and trust. Real trust wasn't given blindly. It was earned through consistency, proven through crisis, and honored through the choice to keep choosing each other even when it was difficult. As he turned off the lights and headed to his own room, Eli reflected on the lesson he'd never expected, to learn from an 8-year-old girl. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths, and the people you least expect to save, you turn out to be exactly the family you never knew you needed. Real family is built through choosing each other again and again, especially when it's hardest. Who has chosen you, and who have you chosen in return? 1 year later, Eli Monroe stood at the window of his home office, the same room where a small girl had once whispered words that changed everything. Watching Isla install security software on Josephine's laptop with the patient expertise of someone who'd found her calling early in life, the sun streamed through windows that now held no secrets, illuminating a space that had been transformed from a target for espionage into a sanctuary for innovation. The walls displayed framed articles about their story, including a feature in Forbes about the 8-year-old who revolutionized corporate security, and a piece in People magazine titled "The Family That Fought Back." But the most treasured item in the room was a simple handwritten note from Isla, framed on his desk. "Thank you for finally listening. Love, your daughter." Your daughter. Not adopted daughter, not foster daughter, just daughter. The distinction mattered in ways that legal documents could never capture. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Josephine asked from the doorway, her voice carrying the gentle concern of someone who'd watched him rebuild his life from the ground up over the past year. Eli nodded, looking at the calendar on his desk. Today marked exactly 1 year since Sabrina's arrest, 1 year since the federal raids that had exposed the Apex Industries conspiracy, 1 year since their family had been forged in the fire of betrayal and emerged stronger than ever. It was also the day he'd chosen to make an announcement that would change everything again. "Ladies," he said, gathering his courage in the way he'd learned to do over the past year, not by shutting down his emotions, but by acknowledging them and moving forward anyway. "I have something important to tell you both." Isla looked up from the laptop, her brown eyes bright with curiosity. At 9 years old, she'd grown taller, more confident, but she still possessed the watchful intelligence that had saved them all. The difference now was that her vigilance came from strength rather than fear, from the security of knowing she was wanted and valued, rather than the terror of potential abandonment. "I've decided to step back from day-to-day operations at the EU company," Eli continued. "I'm promoting Sarah Chen to CEO, and I'm going to focus on research and development. Specifically, I want to work on technology that helps protect families like ours." Josephine smiled knowingly. "You're going to build better security systems for homes, among other things. But more importantly, I want to be present for this family, in ways I wasn't before. I want to be the kind of father who hears what his daughter is trying to tell him the first time she says it, not the 20th. Isla's face lit up with pure joy. "Does this mean you'll have time to help me with the new scanner prototype?" "It means I'll have time for whatever matters to you," Eli replied. "School projects, science fairs, teaching you to drive when you're old enough, scaring away boys when you start dating in about 20 years. 20 years? Isla laughed. That seems excessive. 30 years, then. I'm flexible. Josephine shook, her head with fond exasperation. Men, always thinking they can control timing when it comes to matters of the heart. But her eyes held deep approval as she watched the easy banter between father and daughter. This was what she'd hoped for when she'd first encouraged Eli to really listen to Isla. Not just the resolution of a crisis, but the building of genuine relationship that would sustain them through all the ordinary challenges and joys that lay ahead. There's something else, Eli said, his tone growing more serious. I've been thinking about what we learned this year, about how easy it is for people to be fooled by those who prey on trust and loneliness. I want to do something about that. He pulled out a business plan he'd been working on for months, pages of detailed proposals and financial projections for something entirely new. I want to start a foundation, he explained. An organization that helps people who've been targeted by confidence schemes, romance scams, corporate espionage. I want to provide resources for victims, training for law enforcement, and education programs that teach people to recognize the warning signs. What would you call it? Isla asked, already scanning through the proposal with the rapid comprehension that never failed to amaze him. The Isla Foundation, Eli said simply, named after the person who taught me that wisdom doesn't come from age or experience alone. It comes from paying attention to the truth, even when that truth is inconvenient or painful. Isla stared at him, speechless for one of the few times in their relationship. The idea that her name would be associated with helping others, that her experience and insights would be used to protect people from the kind of deception they'd faced, clearly overwhelmed her in the best possible way. I think, Josephine said quietly, that sounds like exactly the right way to honor what you've all learned. Over the following months, as the foundation took shape and began its work, Eli discovered that the lessons Isla had taught him extended far beyond cybersecurity and corporate espionage. She'd shown him that listening, really listening to the people you love, was the foundation of every meaningful relationship. That trust wasn't something you gave automatically, but something you built through consistent actions over time. That family wasn't about who shared your DNA, but about who chose to stand beside you when life tried to knock you down. Most importantly, she'd taught him that some of the most important truths come from the smallest voices. The children, the overlooked, the underestimated who see clearly because they haven't yet learned to doubt their own perceptions in favor of what others expect them to believe. On the first anniversary of the Isla Foundation, they received a letter from a woman in Ohio whose elderly mother had been saved from a romance scam by information she'd learned from their educational programs. The would-be victim had recognized the warning signs and contacted authorities instead of sending money to someone who claimed to love her but had never met her in person. One more family safe, Isla said softly, as she read the letter aloud during dinner that night. One more person who listened to that little voice inside that says something's not right. Speaking of little voices, Eli said, what is yours telling you about your future? You're getting older, developing your own dreams and goals. What do you want to do with all that brilliance of yours? Isla considered the question with characteristic seriousness. I want to keep learning. About technology, about people, about how to protect the things that matter, and I want to help other kids who don't have families yet find theirs, the way I found mine. That sounds like a perfect plan, Josephine said warmly, and you'll always have us to support you, whatever you decide. As they cleared the dinner, dishes together, a family ritual that had become precious to all of them, Eli reflected on how completely his understanding of success had changed. A year ago, he'd measured his worth by profit margins and market share, by the size of his bank account and the recognition of his peers. Now he measured it by Isla's laughter, by Josephine's contentment, by the knowledge that they'd built something real and lasting together. He measured it by the families they'd helped through the foundation, by the young people who'd learned to trust their instincts because of Isla's example, by the simple but profound satisfaction of living a life aligned with his deepest values. That night, As he tucked Isla into bed, a ritual she still treasured despite her growing independence, she looked up at him with those wise brown eyes that had seen too much too early, but had never lost their capacity for hope. "Thank you," she said, simply. "For what, sweetheart?" "For listening, for believing me, for becoming the kind of father who hears what his daughter is trying to tell him." Eli kissed her forehead, his heart full of gratitude for the child who'd taught him that the most important conversations often begin with whispers, and that the smallest voices sometimes carry the greatest wisdom. "Thank you," he whispered back, "for teaching me how to listen." Outside, the world continued its complex dance of joy and sorrow, triumph and betrayal, connection and loss. But inside their home, three people who'd chosen each other slept peacefully, protected not just by sophisticated security systems, but by the deeper security of being known, valued, and loved exactly as they were. And in the morning, they would wake up together, ready to face whatever challenges came their way, secure in the knowledge that some families are built through crisis and strengthened through choice, and that the most powerful force in the world is a small voice speaking truth. To those wise enough to listen, your voice matters no matter how small it might seem. Your instincts are valuable, your observations important, your truth worth sharing. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that they're seen, heard, and valued. Like this video if you believe in the power of chosen family, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the strength found in unexpected places. Sometimes the person who saves us is the one we least expect, and sometimes that person is ourselves.